Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we'll talk about the process of individuation. I'll give you a brief introduction to what it means to individuate and to what Carl Jung, psychoanalyst Carl Jung, thought individuation entails. In specific, we'll have a few chapters. First, we'll briefly talk about why we should care about individuation at all. We'll then talk about the context, so the unconscious and the ego. We'll talk about the natural process of individuation and then the projected process of individuation in religion and rituals, to then go into the artificial process of individuation, which is the kind of work we engage in today with psychotherapists, and then finally talk about the goal of individuation. Finally, I'll give you my 2 cents and say a few words about individuation as impossibility and the purpose of the subject's existence in the world, not to be a conclusive process of individuation, but more of a indefinite transdescendental movement or rotation around the core that we then refer to as the self, post hoc, let's say. If you're new to the channel, then please consider to subscribe. We're discussing topics on Jungian psychoanalysis and psychology in general, which touch upon, self-development and these kinds of important topics, but most importantly, the questions of how to conduct ourselves in this reality that we're caught in, if you will. So, another important note, please leave a comment if you have any other suggestions for future videos or any other comments or, let's say, proposals. So, why should we care? So why individuation at all? Why should we care about discussing this problematic in the first place? You are not what you are, or you are not what you think you are, which is a broad statement, I think, but we can probably all agree to this unless we've never thought about ourselves in psychological terms at all. If we think simply of ourselves, right? We may think of someone who has achieved certain things, who has certain characteristics, who has certain preferences, but there's a vast amount of things that we would leave out, and still those vast amount of things that we leave out influence our behavior on a day-to-day basis. You're not really able to explain causally why you perform certain actions, why you're snappy in certain moments, why you're sad, why you're happy, why you're aroused in certain given moments, and the reason why this is the case is precisely because there are factors to you that go beyond that which you think you are. That which you think you are is considered the ego. So this moves us to the context. Let's stay quickly with this question, why we care. We care, or we should care, because we want to know more about that which we are in order to let's say, see ourselves within the context of ourselves, properly speaking. This may produce meaning, right? This may give us meaning, but beyond meaning, it may give us the ability to act more consciously and cautiously and to make choices that are informed. I think the most important reason why you should care about studying Jungian psychoanalysis and doesn't matter if you study Jungian psychoanalysis ultimately, but why you should pay more attention to yourself, which is essentially part of the quest of individuation, is because there is a lot to learn, and yourself is the only gateway to reality that you have. Your own interaction with reality is the only gateway you have to this reality. And if you always simply act the way you act, and take it for granted, and you're like, oh, well, this just happens because it happens, then you're limited to essentially that which happens. You're living a reactive life. The question is, if you consider this to be sufficient, or if there's something beyond this reactionism that you would like to explore in your existence. Now, individuation offers us the possibility to do that. Now, the background of this is basically, as I've already interluded a little bit, the tension or the dyad ego and non-ego, right? Ego being that which you narrate, which you tell me that you are and tell yourself that you are, in a given moment. The unconscious, on the other hand, being that which the ego is fundamentally not. Now, the unconscious in Jung has two levels. It has the level of the personal unconscious, which is essentially, I would say, also part of the ego, and the collective unconscious, which is sort of the unconscious, properly speaking, in Jung. By the way, this collective unconscious is also the main difference between, or one of the main differences between Jung, the Jungian and the Freudian perspective on psychology or on psychoanalysis. Now, the personal unconscious, again, is sort of the, very Freudian repressed memories, simply that which you do not include in the sort of photographic library that I would say constitutes your ego. The collective unconscious, on the other hand, is the sort of, let's say, the history or the past, present, and future of all of humanity. That which you share with humanity as a whole and with the precursors of humanity possibly. So it is essentially that which humans have always done. The qua human existence within the context that we've existed. We're all, the most fundamental level you can think about as a sort of part of the collective unconscious are instincts that determine how you interact with nature in a certain way. The bird that builds its nest at a certain position in the world would be considered sort of an archetypal pattern of behavior, or archetypes would be considered a pattern of behavior, and this would be considered then thus an archetype to that extent. Now, what does individuation mean then? Individuation is essentially the process of the ego and the sorry, I'm just noting down timestamps. Individuation is essentially the process of the ego coming to terms with the non-ego. Now, what does individuation mean? What is individuation? Individuation is essentially the process of the ego and the non-ego moving closer together. However, the process of individuation has two phases. The first phase is the ego developing as a differentiated entity, different from the self that it is contained by earlier. So the ego, remember, the ego is here, and the self contains this ego in its sort of fangs, if you will, right? The process of individuation then is the development of a larger wholeness, a process in which the ego unfolds towards what we may say is a more integrated position. Now, this doesn't mean that the ego is sort of somehow moving towards a better moment in its existence, or even that the ego is moving towards something that is, let's say, not itself. It is very important that we do keep in mind that the ego is always only itself. It can always only be itself. The ego can never be something that is non-ego. And this is very important because the ego is something to cherish to a large extent in the Jungian perspective, because the ego is the fundament of everything we experience. If we speak, if we think, all of that is sort of ego driven. Now, the ego nonetheless becomes, let's say, tyrannical in that the ego, as we've discussed, is this narrative building entity that sort of, develops this entity that is detached from reality. In this process of individuation, in this process of creating a larger wholeness, the ego is essentially developing a more integrated position, that is, developing a position in which it considers that which it is not. Now, the natural process of individuation is basically that which is always going on. If you think about it in this way, the seed that you put into the ground grows into a tree. No matter if the tree does something, the seed does something, you do something, it grows into a tree. There are processes that can sort of get in the way, right? If there is another tree that takes away the sunlight, if there's no rain, blah, 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 nutrients are lacking. But essentially the seed unfolds towards something that it is meant to be. Jung thinks about the process of individuation being a similar process in which the psyche, as manifested sort of in this body, materialized in this body, the ego develops into something that it is meant to be. Now, this is very important in the context of thinking about the self, right? Because the self essentially is that which we're meant to be, so to speak. But in the final moments of this video, we'll talk about sort of some reservations on this. I have some reservations on the possibility of this development and even of the sort of purposefulness of a structure that would suggest that we're able to develop into something at all. Now, this natural process of, let's say, development is interrupted by many, let's say, processes that occur. So essentially, as you can read in Erich Neumann's History and Origins of Consciousness, but also I'll make another video on this in the future, the ego essentially develops as a way to deal with the complexity of the social situation that we're navigating. And in the process of this development, the ego essentially cuts us off from precisely this natural process. Now, this allows us to then also navigate the complex societies that we've built, right? So the ego is a blessing on this level. It's a curse on the level of the relationship to the sort of the whole that we've talked about. And this is why the tools develop to deal with the maintenance of this connection, this healthy connection to this natural process of the ego's development, this natural process of this movement towards the self, let's say, this integration of that which is non-ego. And these processes are, we could say, projected states, right? These are religions, rituals, and sort of contexts in which we ourselves, the ego in its very early state, does not have to directly confront that which it may be scared of. Because if you think about it, the ego is very, it's relatively fragile. The ego, as we said, builds all these assumptions, right? And then basically goes into the world and has this rigid structure of assumptions that may always break down. They may not break down, but they may break down in the confrontation with something that is sort of objective, right? This objective core of the psyche. And this is why these religions and rituals function as a sort of retort. And I can show you this image here in this book. Functions as a sort of the retort of the alchemists. This is a retort. Basically, in which the individual, the subject, can individuate, in which it can develop and unfold. This, the function of these retort is essentially to give the ego a buffer, a buffer zone in which it doesn't have to submit itself to the trial and fire, let's say, but the collective protects it from its own dismemberment, let's say. Now, the problem is, and Jung highlights this especially in the sort of process of industrialization and secularization, the religious symbols have lost their numinosity. So there's sort of the impact, the possibility of being this retort. This is why we've developed artificial processes to sort of propel individuation forward. And this would be sort of the analytics setting, the process of analysis, psychoanalysis, the process of engaging sort of in this process of dialogue and maybe even self-analysis. So it's sort of the attempt to always, again, bring the ego into a situation where it can actually engage in this process of individuation, right? Now, again, as I said, the aim of this process is the achievement of a greater wholeness, a more integrated state. And it's very important, again, to emphasize that the ego is in a sort of moment of struggle. The ego individuates. It's not nothing else. You can only individuate through the ego, and you want the ego to be there. And even if you think, well, the ego can break down, and then I can experience something, that is greater than I, perhaps in psychedelic state or dreams, but in the end, you always experience through interpretation, because experience qua experience, qua what it is always the act of interpretation, right? Now, this brings me to the conclusion of this video. And sort of in the conclusion, I want to raise the question whether individuation is even possible, whether the realization of the self is something that we may consider possible, or that we maybe have some reservations on it. I want to propose very strongly that there are reservations on this perspective of being able to realize the self. I believe the ego and the self being in this constant moment of conflict, as Jung highlights to us, basically suggests more that the self acts as a rupturing force on the ego, propelling the ego to continuously develop and move beyond itself. This being a painful process for the ego protects itself, and it's sort of the narrative it has built from this impact of the self, from this impact of the collective, from this impact of this transition, the place to which it should develop. Now, therefore, I believe that the process of individuation is more a constant turning down and up, descent and ascent. This is a constant circular movement that the ego is always engaged in, naturally has to always be engaged in its day-to-day activities. And I'll make a video on this separately because I think it's so important, but I want to mention it here. I think this is called sort of I call this the transdescendental movement of the ego. All right, I just wanted to introduce that quickly. Again, I'll make a more in-depth video on this. And thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking around. And if you like the content on this channel, again, do consider to subscribe, hit the like button, and do leave a comment in the comment section to let me know what other videos you want to hear. Thanks a lot.